The lights flickered once, then went dark. A calm voice cut through the radio. "Center, this is Grace on Flight 214. I have the aircraft." No airline had let her fly in 5 years. She sat quietly in seat 32C, just another tired passenger. But 189 passengers were on board, and every one of them would need her to land. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. Grace sat in seat 32C, near the back of the plane, close to the window. She wore a plain brown jacket and old jeans. Her hair was tied in a loose bun. On her lap was a paper cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. She looked like any tired traveler on a night flight from Denver to Chicago. Nobody looked at her twice. Nobody would have guessed that 5 years ago, her name was known in every major flight school in the country. 2 men in the row in front of her were talking loudly about their jobs as pilots for a small regional airline. One of them turned around and smiled at her in a friendly but careless way. "First time flying this route, ma'am?" "Don't worry, it's smooth all the way." Grace only smiled back and said nothing. She looked out the window at the black sky and thought about a day many years ago. She remembered a small airfield outside the city, rain falling softly on the runway. Her old teacher, a tall man with kind eyes, had placed a small metal pin in her hand. It was shaped like a pair of wings. "You have a gift, Grace," he had said. "One day, this gift will save someone. Keep this pin close. It will remind you who you are, even when the world forgets." She had kept that pin in the small pocket of her bag ever since. She never wore it. She never talked about it. After what happened to her career, she thought she would never need it again. The flight felt normal at first. The engines hummed steadily. A child cried somewhere near the front of the plane. A flight attendant walked down the aisle offering water and small bags of pretzels. But Grace noticed something small that nobody else seemed to notice. There was a light shake in the floor under her feet, a shake that came and went in a strange rhythm. She had felt this kind of shake before, many years ago, during a test flight that almost ended in disaster. She sat up a little straighter and waited. Then it began. A soft bang came from somewhere near the right wing. It was not loud, but a few passengers looked up from their phones and books. A minute later, the captain's voice came through the speakers. His voice was calm, almost too calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We are experiencing a small technical issue. Please remain seated. Everything is under control." Grace did not believe him. Something in his voice told her that he was more worried than he wanted to sound. A few minutes later, the second stage began. Warning chimes rang through the cabin. The first officer's voice came on next, and this time there was no calm left in it. "We are showing multiple system failures. Please listen carefully to instructions from the crew." Passengers began to whisper. A man across the aisle gripped his armrest tightly. A woman 2 rows ahead started praying quietly under her breath. The plane shook again, harder this time. Then came the third stage, the one nobody wanted to hear. The captain's voice returned, and this time he said the words that make every passenger's heart drop. "We are declaring an emergency. Please listen to the flight attendants and prepare for possible turbulence." Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling with a soft hiss. The plane tilted, and Grace felt her stomach lift as the aircraft began losing altitude. All 189 passengers on board were now trapped inside a plane heading toward disaster, with no one at the controls who could fix what was going wrong. A baby started crying. Someone screamed near the front. The flight attendants moved quickly down the aisle, their faces pale but their voices trying to stay steady. This was the moment. Grace had a choice to make. She could sit quietly in seat 32C and hope the crew figured it out. Or she could stand up, risk everything she had already lost once before, and try to save the 189 lives now depending on this flight. Her hands were shaking, but her mind was clear. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up. Would you have stayed in your seat, or would you have stood up like Grace did? Think about that question, because what happens next is the part that surprised even the crew on this flight. A flight attendant rushed toward her. "Ma'am, please sit down, it's not safe to stand right now." Grace did not sit down. She said, calmly but firmly, "I need to speak to the captain. I am a trained pilot." The flight attendant looked unsure, but before she could answer, one of the off-duty pilots from the row ahead stood up too and blocked the aisle gently. "Ma'am, we have professionals up front. Please, let them handle it." His voice was polite, but his eyes told Grace he thought she was just a scared passenger looking for control. At that exact moment, the intercom crackled again. This time the captain's voice sounded tired and worried. "If there is any pilot on board, please make yourself known to the crew immediately." Grace raised her hand high in the air. The flight attendant looked at the off-duty pilot, unsure who to trust. The off-duty pilot studied Grace's calm face for a second, then stepped aside, still doubtful but willing to let her try. They walked her to the front of the plane. The captain opened the cockpit door himself. He looked exhausted, sweat on his forehead, eyes red from stress. He looked at Grace, this quiet woman in a brown jacket, and for a second, doubt crossed his face too. "You're a pilot?" he asked, almost in disbelief. Grace nodded and spoke in a clear, steady voice. "Your right engine is losing power because of a fuel line issue near the wing root. That's causing your hydraulic readings to look wrong, not because the system is actually failing, but because the sensor near that line is damaged. Cut the auto throttle, switch to manual fuel control, and run the checklist for partial hydraulic loss. I've flown this exact aircraft type in test conditions before. I know what this looks like." The captain's eyes widened. Only someone with real training, someone who had worked deep inside this aircraft's systems, could know details like that. He stepped back and let her in. Grace sat down in the empty seat beside the first officer. Her hands trembled for only a few seconds before they became steady again. Quietly, she reached into her bag and pinned the small silver wings to her collar. Nobody on the plane could see it, but she could feel it there, close to her heart, just like her old teacher had promised. "I have the aircraft," she said into the radio, her voice calm and sure. She began working through the emergency steps one by one. Confirming partial hydraulic loss. Switching to manual fuel control on the right engine. Reducing speed to 210 knots. Beginning a slow, controlled descent. The tower on the ground responded quickly, giving her directions to the nearest airport with a runway long enough for an emergency landing. But the crisis was not over. As they lined up for the descent, the left engine started to shake too. For one terrible second, the plane tilted hard to one side. Passengers screamed. The first officer beside Grace froze, his hands stiff on the controls. Grace reached over gently and steadied the plane with a soft, careful movement. "Hey," she said to him, her voice warm despite the danger. "Look at me. Watch your instruments. Breathe with me. We are going to get through this together." The young first officer nodded, his breathing slowing down as her calm voice reached him. The runway lights appeared ahead through the rain, small and far away at first, then closer and brighter. Grace guided the plane down with careful, small movements. The wheels hit the runway hard, harder than anyone wanted, and the whole plane shook. Sparks flew from beneath the wing where the damaged landing gear scraped against the ground. But the plane stayed on the runway. It did not flip. It did not break apart. It slowed down, and finally, it stopped. For a moment, nobody said a word. Then, all at once, the whole cabin let out a breath they had been holding for what felt like forever. A woman near the middle of the plane started crying softly, tears of relief running down her face. A man clapped his hands together and said, "Thank God," over and over. The off-duty pilot who had tried to stop Grace earlier walked slowly to the cockpit door, his face full of shame and gratitude at the same time. "I was wrong," he said quietly. "Thank you. Thank you for not listening to me." When the emergency trucks reached the plane, a tall man in a fire chief's uniform climbed aboard. He walked straight to the cockpit and looked at Grace with wide, surprised eyes. Then he stood up straight and gave her a sharp, respectful salute. "Captain Grace Miller," he said. "The tower already told us who was flying this plane. On behalf of everyone here, thank you for bringing our people home safely." A few weeks after the emergency landing, reporters wanted to know more about the woman who saved 189 lives with no warning and no name badge. They dug into old records and found the real story behind Grace Miller, and it was bigger than anyone expected. 6 years earlier, Grace had been the lead test pilot for a company building a new mid-size passenger jet. She had flown that exact aircraft model more than 200 times, testing it in storms, in engine failures, in every dangerous situation the company could think of. During one of the final test flights, she noticed something wrong. Under heavy stress, the right wing's fuel line would sometimes send false readings to the cockpit, making a working engine look like it was failing, and a failing engine look like it was fine. It was a small flaw, hidden deep inside the design, the kind of problem that most pilots would never notice in a normal flight. Grace reported it right away. She told her managers the plane was not ready, that the flaw could confuse pilots at the worst possible moment, exactly the way it almost did on this very flight, years later. But the company was under pressure. They had already promised airlines the new plane, and fixing the flaw would take months and cost millions of dollars. They asked Grace to sign a paper saying the aircraft was safe to fly. She refused. Within a month, Grace was removed from the project. The company told other airlines and manufacturers that she was difficult to work with and not a team player. No one ever said the real reason out loud, but everyone in the small world of test pilots understood. If you challenge the people who sign your paycheck, you do not get hired again. Grace sent out application after application. Every door stayed closed. She watched from the outside as the same aircraft model, with the same hidden flaw still not fixed, entered service around the country. She worried every single day that something like Flight 214 would happen. She just never imagined she would be the one sitting in the passenger seat when it did. For 5 long years, she worked quiet jobs far from any airport. She fixed small engines at a local garage. She taught basic math at a community center in the evenings. She never told anyone about her past, not even her neighbors. The only thing she kept from that life was a small paperback flight manual she used to study, and a silver wing pin from her old teacher, hidden away in a bag she rarely opened. When Flight 214 began to fail in the exact same way she had warned about years before, something inside her recognized it instantly. It was not luck. It was not chance. It was years of training that never really left her, even after everyone else had tried to make her forget it. After the story came out, the aircraft company faced serious questions from safety officials. Investigators reopened the old reports Grace had filed years earlier and found she had been right the entire time. Airlines that once refused to hire her began reaching out, offering her positions, apologies, and second chances. Grace turned most of them down. She said she was no longer interested in flying passenger planes for profit. Instead, she wanted to make sure no other pilot would ever be silenced for telling the truth. Grace sat on the porch of a small house outside the city. The same silver wing pin rested on the wooden table beside a warm cup of coffee. Her old teacher, now older, with white hair and a walking cane, sat across from her. He picked up the pin and turned it slowly in the afternoon light. "You didn't just land that plane," he said softly. "You reminded everyone why we trust the sky at all." Grace smiled, quiet and calm, the way she always was. Today, Grace works with flight safety programs, helping train the next generation of pilots. She teaches them not just how to fly a plane, but how to stay calm when everything goes wrong, how to trust their training even when nobody else trusts them. Every student who meets her leaves with the same lesson: sometimes the person nobody expects to help is the only one who can. What would you have done in her place? Would you have stayed quiet in seat 32C, or would you have stood up when those 189 lives needed someone the most? If this story touched you, please hit subscribe, because there is a new story waiting for you tomorrow. And somewhere, in a small worn bag, a pair of silver wings still waits quietly for the next moment the sky calls her home.